Welcome to this Aztlander presentation, Night of the Ninth Sun, the Aztec Sun Stone in light of the new fire ceremony of 1507 CE, with Rubén G.Mendoza. Enjoy!
Bienvenidos a esta ponencia sobre el calendario azteca o la piedra del sol. Welcome to this presentation that concerns an interpretation, and I do construe it as an interpretation, of the so-called Aztec calendar. I have many dear friends who continue to see it as strictly as an Aztec calendar, and I don't have an argument with that. I pay deference because normally that has been identified and situated within indigenous identities. Those I absolutely respect. When this particular project came to the fore was the result of an invitation by Dr. Harold Mailer of the museum in Halle, Germany. I had already done a couple of presentations for him, and they were assembling a volume and a symposium devoted to the role of time in power and power as time. And so when I was contacted, I was asked, could you do an analysis of the Aztec Sunstone? And they refer to it as the calendar. And I said, technically, I've never interpreted it as a calendar. It does integrate the elements of the tonalpohualli, the day signs, and the number 52, and the numbers 9 and others are integral to this monument. So I said, however, I'll take it on, and I did. And this was during COVID. So the symposium itself was canceled. And I went ahead and prepared the paper. And the deeper I delved into this particular monument, the more I began to see that of things that I'd never seen before, because though I'd studied the site of Malinalco, the monolithic temples, and looked at them in iconographic context, I was able to interpret that ensemble when I was an undergraduate. And I became obsessed with it. I gave dozens of presentations. At the time, I was a jardinero, basically a gardener. I was mowing lawns to raise the money, and eventually I managed to get to Paris by invitation of Huberto Jimenez Moreno. And I told him, I can't afford to do this, and he convinced me. And there I met some of the top-notch scholars like Nicholson and Jacques Sostel and a host of others. Well, I've always had this on my mind, and I've shared some of my early work with a number of Michael Smith, for example, who had encouraged me, but unfortunately he said, I wish you had stuck with that. And he wrote me some years ago to that effect, and I did appreciate that. And in the interregnum, you could say, I've done a lot of different kinds of projects, and so it makes me look a little flaky, but I love exploration and discovery. So when I was pitted against the sunstone, I thought there's something here that we have yet to see. So today's presentation considers the notion that the central image is an incarnation of Yohualtecuhtli, and it may be a teoixiptla of Motecuhzoma Xocoyotzin, in other words, a deity impersonator, because we know Moctezuma often dressed as various deities during the course of major ceremonies. And of course, in this initial scene, you see the image of Sol Nueve on the left from the Codex Borgia, and then, of course, a replica or a painting by Desiderio Xocoyotzin Hernandez in Tlaxcala, where we see kind of a representation of the new fire ceremony, variously called Ximolpili and Xitlapili, etc. And, of course, in the middle, the sunstone. I start with this quote, and it's probably as arrogant as I can get to quote myself, but I figured it saves me a few words. This is from my 2021 publication, which I shared with a number of scholars, and I got some valuable feedback. The Aztec Sunstone, or calendar stone, was originally situated before the Templo Mayor, and shortly after the fall of the Aztec capital of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, in 1521, was moved to the southeast corner of the present-day Zócalo. On the orders of Archbishop Fray Alonso de Montufar, the monument was dislodged and buried upside down, as it was thought to have inspired a resurgence of violence in that locality. On 17 December 1790, the monument was rediscovered and disinterred and relocated at the west elevation of the southwest bell tower of the Metropolitan Cathedral. When we look at this monument, I've come to see it as what Carl Taube has referred to in various works as the turquoise hearth. In other words, this stone, this monument, is embedded with the iconography of the huei, or turquoise, from the fire serpents, or the turquoise serpents, Xocoyotzin, the turquoise lord, the elements that we often refer to all around the perimeter, all 52 of them, are often referred to as the quincunx. I see those as turquoise tesserae. And so I'm just giving you a little bit of a prelude here. Let me move this thing here. The Aztec Sun Stone was, as I noted, moved to the southwest corner of the Metropolitan Cathedral, where it was for many years. In fact, American soldiers took potshots at it when they basically occupied Mexico City during the US-Mexican War. And surprisingly, it has survived any number of things and was eventually moved to the Museo Nacional in 1885. One of the dimensions of my interest that got me into the study of Aztec iconography and cosmology in particular was, I know I'm taking this a bit far back, but when I was about 12 years old, my father got himself into political trouble. We had to leave the country, so we went to Mexico City, and there I discovered Teotihuacan, kind of like Columbus discovered the New World. But there, as a result, I became fascinated with this monument. And even though I wasn't academically oriented, because we worked day in and day out in the fields, the agricultural fields, as gardeners, breaking rock, all of that, I really didn't have much of a penchant for wanting to pursue education. But this monument literally enlivened my interest in learning all I could about it. I couldn't understand why people like the Mexica would create such what some would refer to as a monstrosity. And this monument has been interpreted variously. But when I was in high school, one of the things that drew me into reading and writing was the fact that I found Justino Fernandez's book, this massive tome, on el arte de la estética mexicana. And he had an entire section devoted to the interpretation of Coatlicue. And while I can't say I agreed with everything that was in the book, it was all I had. And I began to interrogate the monument to the point where I finally, at the age of 17, I graduated from high school early. I was in a rather violent high school. And so I took the time to go to Mexico City to track this monument down myself. I showed up with a backpack full of camera equipment, and this was my sole objective. When I got there, I was in awe of this monument. I literally fell to my knees and I kissed the feet of Coatlicue. And then I began to recite the Lord's Prayer in Nahuatl, which I had learned by virtue of reading and writing and learning as much as I could of the language. I've lost much of that to this day, but obviously a lot of the terminology is still with me. This monument, it represents a constellation of elements, and it is central to the iconography and cosmology of basically the birth of the Mexica nation through the death of the mother goddess and the birth of Huitzilopochtli, the sun deity, and the lord of basically the Atl-Tlachinoli. As a result of those early studies as an undergraduate, when I was 17, I headed to this site, Malinalco. And of course, the first thing that captured my attention were the 13 steps. And I also realized that we have images of what then I referred to as Yohualtecuhtli, the earth deity, and then the fire serpent, Xocoyotzin, with what Payon and others had already identified as the likely image of the sun, as an eagle knight, and then a jaguar knight atop the Tlalpan standing drum with a jaguar skin. And those were the interpretations of the day. Of course, what I saw as a result of my studies of the 5 years from age 12 to 17 was that I was literally looking at an embodiment of the Nahuatl cosmos. And so when I was about 17, I drafted a paper, basically a proposal to study Nahuatl temples in terms of their extant iconography. This was where I focused my attention, and I gave a number of papers, and my study kept evolving as a result. And for those of you that have been to the site, you know that the interior of the monument is one that has representations of the ocelotl, or the jaguar, if you will, and also, of course, 3 eagles, all incarnations by virtue of Payon and others of representations of the sun in a circular chamber. And one of the things that added to this constellation of iconography was what could be termed a semasiographic system. I reviewed a book that was specific to semasiography. And one of the things that we find is that these notches in the walls that you see all around the chamber, according to one account that I read from an archaeological report, they discovered images of the solar rays that were embodied or inserted into these particular notches. So I took that to suggest that this chamber was a devotion to the sun. And of course, when we talk about the so-called sunstone or Aztec calendar, virtually all interpretations in the earliest days, with the exception of the work of Mary Ellen Miller through the Getty and that incredible volume of works that they pulled together and published from articles and ideas that had been presented before. We start with the 1790 publication of Antonio de Leon y Gama, which was one of the first scholarly works to interrogate this monument. And this is what they produced in a way of trying to calibrate and interpret the symbolism of this monument. But the interpretations didn't stop there, and there have been many. And in fact, there's another one I just learned about, Milbrath's interpretation of the iconography of the sunstone is one of the more recent. When we look at this monument, there's a number of things I just wanted to point out and bring to your attention, because they began to really stand out to me as a result. You'll note that we have the essential Xiuhcoatl, the fire, or Xicoqua, the fire serpents running the perimeter. Each of these has paper ties on its tail, which were significantly identified with sacrifice and fire. In other words, these were often tied onto objects that would be set to the torch. We have these elements, which I think are particularly interesting. I know Anthony Aveni, some years ago, I was very much into his work. He identified some of these as potential constellations. In retrospect, I don't believe that's the case. I believe that these are patterns developed from the use of fire drills in order to ignite fires, in order to set fire to the grass bundles of sacrifice that I believe were placed at 8 points all around the perimeter of this monument. And of course, the monument is broken. And then, of course, we have the central visage, a disembodied head with the 4 worlds attached. To summarize, in effect, in advance of the analysis, I see this as an incarnation not only of Moctezuma, which is one of David Stewart's leading interpretations, and because, you know, Klein and others have seen that we literally have the name of Moctezuma Xocoyotzin in the upper register. But I believe this is the portal. And as Mary Ellen Miller indicated, and when I sent her my earliest manuscript, the 21 publication, she wrote back and was intrigued that I was suggesting that this was an incarnation of a Balcourt stone, and that the being at the center is literally coming through that stone into the world of light, which suggests thereby that what this deity is coming from is a world of darkness, especially if you look at the works that are being done in the Sierra de Puebla with Eastern Nahua and their vision of a mirrored cosmos in which the upper world is one of light and white light, and the lower world is literally a mirrored reflection in darkness. And I do believe that a number of scholars, Tim Nab and others, have been looking at the role of the supernatural, light and dark, and so forth. When we talk of the sunstone, among a number of articles that were presented in the volume by Mary Ellen Miller and her colleagues there at the Getty, one of the idea is that we have this monument, the Tlacaxipehualisli, which was a gladiatorial combat stone. And these are very specifically configured with carving at the center with what looks almost like a lock or an opening that would allow for the tethering of a rope to hold a captive who would then fight usually about 5 fully clad and armed warriors. If they survived, then they were given their freedom. Many of them did survive, and they became gladiatorial sacrifices. When we look to greater antiquity, of course, the Aztec or the Mexica were very much ensconced in looking at the sites of antiquity. They, in fact, excavated Tula Hidalgo, if you want to call it an excavation. They plundered the site for monuments that could lend itself to their own iconography and their cosmology. I won't go into what I believe the Toltecs were, but other than to say, I believe they were the barefoot aristocracies that fled Teotihuacan during the demise. And I have a paper to that effect in a previous Springer volume, in which titled Tolan Teotihuacan. So again, there is continuity on a level that I believe is much more consistent than we often give credit to, whether the Toltecs or some of those like at Cacaxtla, Xochicalco, and other sites. When it comes to interpreting the origins of the so-called new fire ceremony, which many of you have some sense of what that ceremony is. Some of you are scholars to that effect. But this was a ceremony conducted purportedly every 52 years to represent the passage of a new sun. And during that period, ceramics would be broken, a fire would be kindled in the open cavity of a sacrificed captive, usually at the top of El Cerro de la Estrella, which is a fascinating site I visited many years ago. And at that location, they would kindle a fire and they would send runners into the city of Mexico Tenochtitlan and through the valley to relight the fires that had been extinguished right before what we might construe as the midnight hour. There were earlier studies, for example, at Xochicalco, that argued that the new fire was kindled first at that site in the mid-7th century. While those were compelling arguments, I couldn't believe that insofar as the idea that this would have been the first site, because I'd seen indications at the pyramid, the so-called Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, of monuments like this that suggested a death's head version of the sun. And I realized the rays could be a fan nape ornament of the type used by the Huasteca or the Mexica, but I see this in a very different way, especially after the work of Fash and his colleagues and others basically examined the iconography of many of the stone monuments at the base of the Sun Pyramid, particularly those identified with a temple identified as the Adosada, which is that platform that extends from the front of the main staircase. There, they believe, Fash and his colleagues believe, that a new fire ceremony was conducted. And Fash, of all people, I wasn't expecting a Mayanist to jump on this wagon and say the Maya were coming to Teotihuacan, or Teohuacan, as I prefer to call it, to undertake a fire ceremony for the investiture of kings. Fash has several absolutely fascinating articles that lend themselves to this argument. So I'm on board with what Fash has to say, and I believe that Teohuacan was in fact the place of the sun, as has recently been reinterpreted. But more than that, it was a place for the investiture of kings in fire ceremonies identified with this very thing. Interestingly, though much of the literature argues that the Mexica only conducted the ceremony every 52 years, it's kind of a stereotype. The reality is the Mixteca and a host of other groups were conducting fire ceremonies for investiture of kings and lords throughout Mesoamerica. So it's more than just a singular cosmological event. It is part of a pattern of ritual conflagrations, if you will, that were conducted through time and at varying times across many different ancient nations. I gotta take my Zompantli drink here. One of the ideas that intrigued Mary Ellen Miller, she was good enough to respond to me, as was Cecilia, when I sent them my earlier 2021 article published in Germany, was this idea that, and as you can see, I've done a little bit of Photoshop here. Everybody gets accused of it. Well, I'm admitting it here. I basically took the sunstone at the summit of the temple stone, otherwise known as el Teocalli de la Guerra Sagrada, and I eliminated the central Olin element. And what we have is what appears to be a ball court ring. You see the Xihuitl here extend around the perimeter, but these are paired with the sacrificial thorns or bone perforators that extend all around the perimeter here, which I also argue is akin to what a number of scholars have identified with the sunstone. What's interesting about this is I was led to this conclusion as a result of a number of these monuments, these ball court stones, that in fact have the Xihuitl or turquoise fire element extending out of them. And so I do believe that what we're looking at is a conflation of a number of dynamics: the ball court, the ball player, the sacrifice, the emergence of the sun, and a whole host of things identified with sun and turquoise and blood sacrifice. When we look at, and I drew upon Christian Vilela and Mary Ellen Miller's edition for this particular image. And what we have here is a replica of what was interpreted by Victor Manuel Maldonado to represent the original polychromy of the sunstone. And you note that there is a yellow background, much like the monument of what has been referred to as Yohualtecuhtli, that was excavated in about 2010 in the Templo Mayor. And that I find intriguing because it suggests the earth, it suggests a number of different iconographic dimensions. But you see the tails, the polychromy that was interpreted showed what appeared to be a turquoise colored background. And then of course, turquoise colored serpent heads, or the Ma's or Ophidian creatures. And all along their perimeter, we have what has been variously interpreted as flames or butterflies extending all around the edge of this structure. And again, at the center, Maldonado had difficulty interpreting the polychromy of the central image because it appeared to have been blackened. And he, though, interpreted it as likely a dark blue or a light blue that had been subjected to fire. And that's key to some of the analysis here. This is an image. I like to hire students when I can to help them out, especially if they're graphic artists. And I hired one of my students, Madeline Rapella. She was able to publish several images and started her own graphic arts firm. But I had her take on the challenge of the sunstone. And I was closely monitoring a lot of the detail. There are obviously some minor discrepancies here and there, but it pretty much replicates what was done by Maldonado in this regard. And then, of course, you see a black and white image of the same. Bear in mind, as I had said before, the fire ceremony is something that has great depth and antiquity. And here we have in the Chichimeca, or the Mapa de Cuautinchan, individuals using a fire drill to start a fire. I'm not going to argue that this is a formal fire ceremony, but the Chichimeca origins of some of this I will talk about later. So when we talk about the turquoise Lord of Fire, these are images I shot during the Getty exhibition in Los Angeles. And this was part of a study that I did for in a book edited by Christian Sen, Chacon, and others. I submitted a paper called the Turquoise Corridor. I didn't call it the Turquoise Trail because I do believe that even a trail can have ramifications beyond the dendritic nature of that trail and expand over a fairly substantial area. Because once people see that there's something worth gaining from a particular trade in turquoise, for example, they will be drawn to that area, and craftsmen, craftswomen, and others will find themselves engaged and benefiting from this transaction. What the paper in that case argued, I argue in the Cambridge University Press book, that one of the things that I believe, based on what happened in 550 AD or thereabouts, we see a rupture in the Teotihuacan presence in the Maya lowlands. And I've gone there to photograph the iconography. When I was a student of T. Patrick Culbert's, he argued with me that the evidence was not that compelling. My dissertation ended up shifting to studying the Maya impact on highland Mesoamerica. And let's just say I left there without having convinced anybody that the Maya were in central Mexico. even though there was evidence, a lot of it was published by Mexican scholars. And without naming names, let's just say I was told that the Mexican literature is all gray literature. You're not to use it for your dissertation. And I went against that. I decided this work is valuable for what it has to say about each site for which we have very little information at this point. Sites like Tonatiuh was barely undergoing excavation. Nobody had an idea at what point this civilization rose. And I was compelled to believe it was an epiclassic site based on what little iconography I saw and some of the ceramics. What I'm arguing in the Cambridge University paper is that there was a bifurcation of elite status in Mesoamerica as a result of the conflict that ultimately expelled Teotihuacan from the Maya lowlands. And in my dissertation, I document the way in which we literally begin to see Teotihuacan at the beginning of the 6th century, literally beginning to extend its tentacles into the northwest, into the northern frontier, and into the west. And I was intrigued by that. Sites like La Quemada, Alta Vista were sites that I was compelled to believe had something to do with the emergence of a new mining industry focused on what we might call social jade. In other words, jade that is not truly jade, but it happens to be green, or blue. And eventually the connection with Alta Vista, I contend, with the Southwest led to the importation, and this has been argued by others. They began importing turquoise, and we begin to see that right before the collapse of Teotihuacan. So I'm arguing that we have a Mexicanization identified with turquoise and a Maya, earlier Olmec tradition dependent strictly on jade. And so we see that bifurcation. Whether it's real or not, time will tell, but I do see it in the archaeology that I have looked at over the years. When we think of the use of turquoise, the question is, what would have compelled the Teotihuacanos and later the Toltecs, and of course the Mexica and other civilizations like that of the Mixteca, what would have compelled them to take on turquoise as so valuable a commodity? Well, the extension and what we see in many of the recent studies is that there was a link between central Mexico and West Mexico, the area near San Blas, and into the American Southwest. The West contains many of the elements that we often identify with the Maya lowlands. For example, there are parrots there, and parrots could have been moved between West Mexico and the Southwest without ever engaging the Maya lowlands. And yet those parrots came from somewhere, and they've become part of the biology of the region. There were other elements. For example, the copper trade was significant there, but copper and turquoise co-occur in various regions. But in the Southwest, at Cerrillos in particular, New Mexico, turquoise could be gotten in places like Alta Vista. It could be reprocessed into turquoise tesserae and then sent on to the Mixteca, to the Mexicans, and they were using it to create these elaborate headdresses and garments that were worn by the emperors and the great lords. These particular accoutrements have been looked at, and there are a number of studies that look at the linguistics of the use of turquoise and the garments. And with no disrespect, let's just say there have been previous scholars who argue that the garments with the rectangular blue patterns with the holes in the middle are somehow tie-dye. I don't believe that. I believe they're in fact representations of turquoise garments, which would have been relatively heavy. And here we see Diego Rivera's rendition of literally one of the headdresses. And of course, the double-headed serpent. I believe this is a representation of a fire serpent, like that extends around in kind of a bicephalous fashion around the perimeter of the Aztec Sunstone. These were key to the iconography of Yohualtecuhtli, the turquoise lord, who was in turn linked to the notion of kingship, or the emergence and investiture of the great Tlatoani. I might also note that there have been analysis done of these pieces, and I know there have been recent studies that argue, oh no, this stuff didn't all come from the Southwest, we just don't know where it came from. Well, that's not good enough for me. I want to work with what we do know. And one of the things we do know is this piece in particular, studied by the British Museum, does have, in fact, southwest turquoise. So this is a slide I just added because it's from my latest article that I initially set up for Mexico Lore, and then it was adopted by for publication in the Aztlander magazine. I appreciate the incredible hype that both of those groups have given this study that I've allowed to just kind of languish in the background, because I'd made a commitment to the Germans that I wouldn't republish or distribute my article for at least a year. I gave them 3 years. And then this year I decided, you know what, I need to get back on the horse here, or the fire serpent as the case may be, and decided to look at this. And while I was revisiting my earlier paper, this particular note from Fray Diego Duran in circa 1558, he says, the sacrifice of the 8 captives, and the number 8 is significant here, was followed by the ritual kindling of a fire atop the monolith. When the sacrifice had ended, the priest took from the shrine of Huitzilopochtli a serpent made of paper coiled about a pole, all made of red arara feathers. A priest carried the snake, twisted about the pole. He then set it on fire and walked around the stone, incensing it with smoke. While it was still burning, he climbed to the top of the monolith and threw the still smoldering serpent, Oxiuhtli, upon all the blood that bathed the stone. At this moment, a great paper mantle was brought and was cast upon the stone. It burned together with the serpent until there was nothing left of it, and the blood was consumed or had dried, unquote. For me, this is a very compelling statement. It could relate to any number of monuments that have the iconography of the sun, but he's referring to this monolith, and the depictions identified with Duran and others show these kinds of ceremonies being undertaken. Interestingly, other parts of Duran refer to these paper serpents that covered the balustrades of the Templo Mayor, the great temple, and these would be ignited, and then the balustrades would literally catch fire. So you're literally seeing an incarnation of the cosmovision of the Atl Tlachinoli, basically what I deem the holy war, blood and fire mixed together and representing and forming an incarnation of the Atl Tlachinoli, which was a central theme and ethos of the Mexica Aztec Empire. This lends itself to an idea I've had for some years now, which I haven't published. I've mentioned it in other articles. The idea that these turquoise encrusted skulls, like this one from LACMA in Los Angeles, may well represent some of these great lords, Tlatoani or others, who were being represented in this way. It could also mean that these were individuals sacrificed in the context of new fire ceremonies. So I'm revisiting this. And of course, it's still a long shot, but I do believe that these skulls bore great significance for an identification with new fire, investiture, and kingship. Netzahualpilli, here represented with his Xitlalpili, Tilmatli, Tenisho, or turquoise knotted tie cape and border of eyes. This is something that I found particularly interesting because Olco, in her work, she's produced incredible work related to re-examining a lot of the terminology related to the iconography of the Mexica. And in there, she identifies this robe, not so much with the idea of a tie-dye, but rather with the idea that it is literally a turquoise knotted tied cape with a border of stellar eyes, for example. In this case, this garment relates to another paper I presented where I believe the so-called step fret element, step fret. Rosemary Sharp some years ago did an analysis of this and interpreted it as being identified with elite contexts. Well, I think it goes beyond that. I actually believe that the Altepetl, or the stepped fret, is in fact the Altepetl, the water mountain. We have the spiral, we have the steps, and if I were to take it by extension further, as I presented some years ago at the Mesoamerican Symposium in LA, I believe that sites that bore this iconography were in fact sites that were the seats of kingdoms, and the pyramids built there were intended to represent the water mountains. So when we look at the semasiographic system, what are we looking at? I've already alluded to the central element being a portal. So one could argue either way, but I see what appear to be elements that are not integrated to the extent that all the rest of the iconography is. It's as though you could literally go in and pull this creature out of there and you would have what appears to be a ball court ring. When we look at the details of the face, there are certain elements that I find rather intriguing here, which a number of scholars have looked at in an effort to interpret, and there have been a number of interpretations. And one of the favored, especially in the context of Mexican nationalism, is this represents the zenith sun. It represents the Coatli, the eagle, the soaring eagle. And that's a wonderful image. And bear in mind that we can't always separate nationalism from the realities of the iconography or the ethnohistories or the archaeology. And I nevertheless respect those views without needing to contest them, except I'm presenting another view, and that's the way I see it. We have the so-called four suns, but as I will show in a few minutes, when we look at these rectangular elements, these have often been touted as the four previous suns. I believe, based on some of the work done on the Eastern Nahua, that these actually represent scrying mirrors into which you can see the previous suns alighting in another world. Not necessarily Mictlan, although that's been implied. There's a number of studies recently that are questioning the idea of the Mexican underworld or the Mexica underworld. Depending on whether, if you talk to John Pohl, you have the Western variant of the Nahua and the Eastern variant. John believes that the Western variant was more identified with dark magic, the supernatural, the dark arts, if you will. And so the question is, who were the Mexica? Their world was filled with human sacrifice, warfare, the Atlachinoli, and probably the biggest catalog of variations on human sacrifice I've ever seen. Every imaginable way to dispatch a human being for your God. And so when we look at this, think of this, and again, I have an image that you might laugh at later, but think of this as the butterfly, Saturnae, which is a moth that happens to have wings, especially among the Chichimeca. They refer to these moths as the la mariposa de los cuatro espejos, the butterfly of the four mirrors. And so because of that, and the link to what I believe is going on here, I believe this takes us back to the primordial origins of the Chichimeca and thereby the Nahua and Mexica, where we have the four mirrors. And if you look at the butterfly, it actually has transparent lenses in its wings that the native peoples of the north refer to as arrowheads, but you can see through them. So you're literally looking into that other world. Another element that I want to point out before I move on, you note the headdress here, or what has been referred to the xihuitl, because we have the xihuitl element all across this monument 8 times. And if you include the central element, we have a conflation of not only the xihuitl or fire element or element of sunlight, we also have these elements here, which could be bone perforators, or as I prefer to think of them, as huistli or agave thorns that have been plunged into the center of this great ball of sacrifice. And there are 8 of those that extend around the perimeter. So those 8 thorns and those 8 rays of light are linked to ritual bloodletting. When you look at the central element, this so-called headdress or ray of light, and this element down here, you have the 9th thorn or the 9th xihuitl or ray of light. So the number 9 replicates itself repeatedly in this monument, which would thereby lend to the idea that this represents the 9th Lord, the 9th Sun, Sol Nueve, or the 9th huei Tlatoani, who was in fact Motecuhzoma Xocoyotzin, the 9th Tlatoani of the Mexica people. So I believe that's the connection to the notion that Moctezuma, not only by having his name here, was literally representing his investiture as the 9th sun, Sol Nueve. when we look at the elements on the perimeter border of the sunstone, and we can refer to it as a calendar stone, although I'm becoming less convinced, although Masatzin is a dear friend of mine. He's devoted his life to that understanding. He is very articulate, very understanding of this iconography, and I respect his views on that, because when Mesoamerican monuments were created, especially among the Central Mexicans, there is often a conflation. You have androgyny. For example, maize is in fact androgynous. It literally fertilizes and reproduces itself. The same thing with the agave. It is a plant, and I elaborate on this in my article called The Harvest of Souls in my latest book on ritual human sacrifice. In that, I'm talking about the androgyny that comes from that, the presence of the huisli thorns that come from the agave, and then, of course, we have maize or maize, which is literally the blood of the ancestors. It is our sustenance. It is the mountain of sustenance. But when we look at the fire serpents, interestingly enough, when you go into the Chichimeca in regions as far afield as the American Southwest, we have these, what I might refer to as Xonequili, which is the blue worm that occurs in a lot of the iconography of the codices. Here they signify the Citlal Xonequili, or the blue worm, which in some context of the iconography are interpreted in terms of Canis Major or the Pleiades, which is in turn linked in the iconography. If you look at this monument of a Xiuhcuatl fire serpent or turquoise serpent, this has in turn been interpreted as a representation of the Pleiades. And I realize that that could be construed as still speculative, but the iconography is apparent in varying documents. And so I believe, and I once spent a night trapped at the end of the Guatemalan Civil War in a mountain pass. The bus couldn't get through because of guerrillas. And so we had to go back to a little village, and there they had a cinder block building, a corrugated tin roof where I could camp out. There were no doors on it. It had corrugated tin roof, no electricity, no running water. And I asked how much, and they said, oh, dame, tanto. It was about $1. I wasn't going to turn that down. But when I entered the room to pay the $1, I had my hand propped up against the door jamb, and I saw something very large right next to my hand move away. So I grabbed my penlight flashlight, aimed it, and it was a spider the size of a large tarantula. And I thought, what the hell is this? And I asked the woman, I says, are these venomous or poisonous? And she said, oh, no, my husband was bitten 2 weeks ago. He's better now. And I thought, there is no way in hell I'm going to, put myself in that situation. But the point of this is that when I aimed the flashlight around the room, there were these worms, these centipedes of varying sizes all over the walls, and they were just squiggling everywhere. It was like I'd entered into Xibalba, the Maya underworld. And then they were accompanied by scorpions of varying sizes. And I won't go into further detail, but it was clear that I was going to have to use duct tape to seal off my collar, my wrists, and my boots, because there's no way in hell I was going to allow a centipede or scorpion under my clothes. That's the last thing. That's the last way I want to die. But anyway, you get the point that we have these creatures identified with the far north, with the La Gran Chichimeca, and they seem and appear to be linked to some of the iconography of even Pacal, where Pacal's the maw of the underworld has been reinterpreted by a number of scholars as linked in some way to the centipede. And these glow in the dark, by the way. When we look at a host of monuments created during the reign of Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, the temple stone is one that has intrigued me for a long time, in large part because of the number of steps, the 13-step staircase, which I identified at Malinalco. And though I do see it as linked in some way to the celestial realm, the 13 levels of the heavens, it's also effectively linked to the Tonalpohualli. So it's not a singular representation. The numerology is varied and is contextually relevant. But at the summit, you see a sunstone with literally Huitzilopochtli and Moctezuma Xocoyotzin represented next to this massive monument. And by the way, this monument, so-called temple stone, or Teoixiptla de la Guerra Sagrada, has a couple of outstanding characteristics. First, it was dedicated in 1507. for the new fire ceremony of that time. And on the back of the monument, we have the image of the eagle with the Aztlander literally perched atop a symbol or a stone on a body of water. That has become the Mexican national flag and the primary icon of Mexican people. Other elements identified with the sunstone are, of course, the teoixiptla, which signals the idea of blood sacrifice, human heart excision. And here we see, for example, the smoke mirror, which one could construe as identified directly with the Tezcatlipoca, and then the fire and water of the Aztlander. When we look at these elements, and I'll just recap here briefly, this was something that I looked at in order to try to segregate out elements. We have the huei, or the fire elements, that we see throughout. And then if we add this central element, we have 9 in total. If we go to Yohualtecuhtli, the Lord of Night, we have him at the center, but we also have these agave thorns or bone awls that literally perforate this central element. And when you add the element at the bottom, replete with its jade piece or turquoise, we have, again, 9 elements. When you look at the amount of turquoise represented in the sunstone in the lower left, you have Yohualtecuhtli on the left. He's been identified there by scholars in the past, but folks were having difficulty interpreting who was on the right. I was able to identify, and I believe this may be correct, that the paired companion for the Codex Borbonicus, which was actually created to celebrate the new fire ceremony of 1507, the paired companion of Yohualtecuhtli, identified with kingship, is in fact Tlahuizcalpantecuhtli, the planet Venus, or the Lord of Dawn. So these two are linked intimately to the idea of kingship and investiture of kings. And then finally, on the right, lower right, you see Yohualtecuhtli, if you accept that interpretation. And on the sides, you see these cupules, which I was always fascinated by, but when it's broken, you can't count them all. So I used the symmetry to get at the fact that we have 8 of those, which would, I believe, have held the Zacatepolli, which are the grass balls of fire, into which priests who had just done bloodletting with thorns, they would insert them into the grass balls. So I believe that these were cupules used to hold those balls. And if in fact the ceremony with the flaming paper fire serpent was done, I could see these being ignited in that one ceremony in which 8 captives had been sacrificed, and then the fire was ignited with the paper serpent atop the monument. Okay, you've seen this image. This is by Desiderio Hernandez Xocoyotzin, and of course it shows the kindling of the fire among the Tlaxcalteca, in this case being done with an animal as opposed to a human. They've sacrificed the animal, the blood has been let, and the kindling of the fire is about to take place. The descriptions of this particular ceremony among the Nahua or the Mexica are much more graphic, and then involves the sacrifice of a captive and then the kindling of the fire over the body, and the body is then immolated or consumed. When we talk about the Tlalpili, new fire ceremony, these are quotes that I've drawn from a number of scholars and historians of the Franciscan and Dominican groups. The most basic elements in the Aztec annals after the year count are the sequent rulers and the binding of the years of the new fire ceremony. Excuse me, I'm going to turn this down. Is the new fire ceremony at the turn of the 52-year cycle. So Boone identifies this. This is the primordial or principal ceremony. Elson and Smith talk about the hierarchy and the distribution of the new fire followed the imperial order. The twin temples at the Templo Mayor received the first flames, then Huitzilopochtli's Calmecac, then other temples in Calmecac, then various Telpochcali, and finally individual households. Thereupon, as the fire was being blessed, and this is by Motolinia, thereupon, as the fire was being blessed, waiting Indians from many towns carried new fire to their temples. They did this after asking permission from the great chief of Mexico, Motecuhzoma, the pontiff who was, as it were, their pope. They performed this with great zeal and haste. Although the place might be many leagues away, they went in such haste that in a short time they placed the fire there. In the provinces distant from Mexico, they performed the same ceremony, and it was done everywhere with much feasting and rejoicing. Sahagún basically recounts that first they put out fires everywhere in the country around, and the statues hewn in either wood or stone, kept in each man's home and regarded as gods, were all cast into the water. Also, were these cast away, there was sweeping very clean, rubbish was thrown out, none lay in any of the houses. And then finally, the Codex Tudela says, y quebraban todas las ollas y cantaros que habían servido y los comales y vasijas a que tenían todo lo quebrayan. And they broke all the jars and pitchers that had been used, and the cooking griddles and other vessels that they had, all were broken. And again, I draw that from Elson and Smith. Their paper concerns the archaeological manifestation of evidence of the new fire ceremony in the provinces. This is a key piece of evidence for something I'm doing with other sites in Mesoamerica and beyond. When we look at the depiction of the turquoise hearth that has been addressed in a number of places, but this is from the Codex Borbonicus, which I've had this thing for years and it hadn't dawned on me. This is probably a key to interpreting the new fire ceremony of 1507. And so as I pored over this, it began to dawn on me that when we look at this, you'll note that each of the figures at the center, the fire priests, are all painted in black. And this is likely because there was a concoction that was smeared on the bodies of priests that consisted of ololique, or Jimson weed, which is a hallucinogen that Timothy Leary knew well. And then, of course, scorpions, centipedes, and other venomous creatures were then ground up into a poultice and would cover the body and cause welts on the priest. It was like a form of penance. But you'll notice here we have the so-called quincunx, which I believe is in fact a representation of turquoise. We have the turquoise hearth at the middle, and we see these circular elements that in the Maya region and throughout, we often interpret at Teotihuacan, for instance, as representing jade. Here, I believe they represent that which is precious, a green stone, kind of a social jade, as opposed to a geological jade. And I've published on that particular topic to address those distinctions. Again, we go back to the representation of a mask that I believe represents an incarnation of Yohualtecuhtli, which would have been appropriate to have been worn by someone like Moctezuma Xocoyotzin in his incarnation as literally the Lord himself, the turquoise Lord. At the base, and I've already alluded to this, the iconography, though rather damaged, I've already talked about how in the Codex Borbonicus, we have a pairing of Yohualtecuhtli, the turquoise Lord, with basically Tlahuizcalpantecuhtli, the Lord of Dawn. And if you look at these this representation, here we have Yohualtecuhtli, the turquoise Lord, with literally an incarnation of Tlahuizcalpantecuhtli, or a variation of the Lord of Dawn, except they've been reversed, which I find interesting because much of the iconography in the Aztec Sun Stone has been turned over as though we're looking at it from the underworld. Even the elements of the Tonalpawali run counterclockwise and in a fashion that's distinctive, but also represented in the Codex Borgia in the same cycle and directionality. When we look at the perimeter of the sunstone, that gets short shrift. Oftentimes, it's kind of like my scholarship. I publish these things and I never see them cited, which is all right because the next generation may benefit or not. But I think we all have that experience at one point or another. When you look at the perimeter of the raised circular platform, if you will, that holds the sunstone, you have these images that clearly are linked to not only the Itzpapalotl, or blood sacrifice, but also to this stellar eye element. which Milbrath and others have identified with, for example, the planet Venus. And these stellar eyes have also been identified with a representation of the night. So I would ask if, in fact, we are looking at Tonatiuh, who represents the zenith sun, why is all the iconography linked to the underworld, to the place of darkness, and to the celestial skies with these images of the stars, which suggests to me, again, a image or a representation of a moment that involves the nocturnal sun. I might note that in addition to this element from Cacaxtla, we see these pectorals and also nose ornaments, or yacamesli, that represent Itzpapalotl, who was in fact a deity, the clawed butterfly, that can be found as far back as Teotihuacan. With the destruction of the city in the conflagration of the mid-6th century, images of Itzpapalotl at that site were smashed and strewn across the plaza of the Ciudadela that holds the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. So again, we go back to the temple stone, the representations that I've already identified, this one having been interpreted as Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, dressed as a Chichimeca, an ancestor. And then, of course, Huitzilopochtli with the Atl Tlachinoli, or fire and blood element, shown straddling the sunstone. And I realize some will say, well, how do you know that's the sunstone? Well, the iconography for me is relatively clear. These monuments, I argue, were both created for the celebration of 1507 and the new fire ceremony. We also have these bundles, again, identified. This one is from the new fire of the Acatl, or two reed. And then, of course, we have essentially the Zacatapoyoli, here, that grass ball of sacrifice. Here are the thorns, and here we see the agave serrated edge, so typical. And yet the thorns inserted into the middle of the sunstone also have these elements at the top, suggesting that which is precious. We have the thorns here convinced me that the ones represented on the sunstone are, in fact, basically huistli, or agave thorns, which would have been the thorns used for bloodletting or auto-sacrificial bloodletting by the priest of the sun. When we talk about the iconography and the cosmology of the Mexica, clearly much of our attention has been devoted to ritual human sacrifice, and I'm guilty of that as well. Ironically, I've studied the American Indian, my ancestors who were Yaqui or Nevome. I was very proud of that. But at one time, I believed I was a Neo-Mexica. I'm the new Aztec. And until my grandmothers basically turned around and said, "Eres pendejo, no eres Azteca, eres Yaqui, como yo. You're not an Aztec, idiot. You're Yaqui. You should be proud of that." Well, I went from empire builders to hunter-gatherers in one fell swoop, but I'm proud of that. And even so, I see the origins of much of what the Mexica ultimately drew into the centrality of their cosmology as linked to what the Chichimeca were doing in the northern frontier, even at places like Alta Vista, where we have a melding of Teotihuacan, possibly Toltec, and Chichimeca elements into a site that is absolutely fascinating, and also held rooms with what Tiesler has recently called marionettes, skeletal marionettes in a chamber with heads and body parts hanging from the ceiling timbers. Here, I was invited to examine this structure because it was one that I had published on many years before in 2007. And I drew largely from the writings of the Spanish themselves. And of course, I get chided for doing that because, especially when you're talking about colonial architecture and missions, it's all propaganda. Well, the Aztecs had their share of it. Today in our society, obviously, we have our share of it, especially in this political moment. And so I'm not so concerned about propaganda. I'm concerned about the incarnation and the realities of political expediency and how it translates into technologies and architectures of terror and aggression. And this is one of the keynote representations. When I first published on this, I was attacked for arguing that this thing even existed. And yet now we have the earlier incarnation. This was the earlier structure from the late 15th century. The one that the Aztecs replaced it with and built over this one was much larger. And this one, Raul Barrera said, Dr. Mendoza, I think I was standing there right above it, and I think you're right. This has the potential to hold thousands of human crania. And the age span for these, contrary to popular opinion, we tend to think, oh no, it was only volunteers who went up willingly and they were warriors from enemy tribes. Well, we have 5-year-olds, we have men and women and children, and then we have people as old as well, I shouldn't say old because I'm well past that, in their 40s. And so this structure clearly is a manifestation of the cosmic terror that was central to monuments like the Sunstone. So I have just a few more images here, but this one, when you look at the iconography, and again, I guess I struck the wrong button there. It went silent. You probably think I was having some misgivings about continuing. But anyway, here we have the Codex Borgia, plate 39 and 40. And in this, we see Sol Nueve. And Anders and his colleagues have examined this closely. And you'll note the images of the tonal powali that similarly appear on the Aztec Sunstone running in counterclockwise fashion. You have the ball court with a human sacrifice, or a skeletal sacrifice, if you will, at the center of the ball court. And in one of my earlier publications, and in an article that I did on ritual sacrifice, one of the reviewers of the book said, I can see why, descendants, like what I call Neo-Mexica, usually Chicanos like myself, who identify with the Aztecs, you could see why they would reject my interpretations of this. Well, they're interpretations, but by virtue of the documentation that exists, because the sacrifice in the ball court was pretty graphic, and usually it involved a decapitation or the slitting of the throat and the dragging of the body of typically a female to cleanse the court, so to speak. So we have a sacrifice taking place in the middle of the ball court, and then we have Sol Nueve literally being dispatched by 9 supernaturals. All of them are covered with the black ointment, as is the sun. And you note the iconography of the sun's eye and the dot, which on the sunstone is heavily damaged. And you could argue, if you want to go that direction, say, well, how do you know that that's the same iconography? Well, I've looked at it as closely as I possibly can without receiving a major grant to do the analysis, hint, hint. And so I work with what I have. And right now, this document, the Codex Borgia, I would contend is in fact a document identified with the new fire ceremony of 1507. So we have the Temple Stone, 1507, the Hackmack box, 1507, and a host of other monuments, including the Sunstone. Then we have the Codex Borbonicus, and then we have the Codex Borgia. And if it looks like a duck, and it quacks like a duck, and it walks like a duck, I'm going to call it a duck, or I'm going to call it the new fire ceremony of the Codex Borgia. So I believe this sacrifice that's recounted in detail in the chronicles that Anders and his colleagues used to interpret this particular element make clear that this is a sacrifice that took place in a sunken courtyard with the tonal powali symbols running around the perimeter and adjacent to a ball court. I would be willing to, well, I don't know if I need to stake my career because I'm an emeritus professor, and I'm kind of transcended that, is simply to say I would be willing to stake my emeritus status on the idea that this represents the temple of the Cihuacuatl, the dark temple of the Cihuacuatl, the sacrifice of Sol Nueve by the 9 deities that are part of the sacrifice that was undertaken of the 8 warriors that are identified by Duran next to the ball court, and thereby identifying the sacrifice of Sol Nueve, Nine Sun, or Yohualtecuhtli, with the ball court that I see, as in my previous publication, The Divine Gourd Tree. I see the ball court and it's linked to the Tzompantli or skull rack. The skull rack represents the nascent maize emerging from the cleft earth, which is the ball court. So when we look at the sunstone, we look at it in a different light. You don't have to agree with this interpretation. If you go to the Aztlander magazine, I have my latest interpretation. It doesn't go as far afield as I went in the German publication in 2021, but I was able to produce something that for a broader audience, because it was requested, a manuscript on the sunstone was requested on the basis of another talk like this that I'd done. And of course, I'm trying to boil it all down while dealing with multiple projects. And so I do have a delineation, more specifically, of exactly what we're talking about. I want to pull a quote that I don't have in here it is. So when we look at this, I'm referring to this in my latest iteration as Tlatoani, or the sacred bundle. And if you look at the Zacatepolli reference that I made, where we have literally the thorns of auto-sacrifice literally plunged into the body of this Zacatepolli, aka ball court ring, aka night sun, aka Itzpapalotl emerging from the underworld, and the image of Moctezuma as an incarnation and a kind of a transliteration or conflation, if you will, all of this in one monument. But when you take the fact that the turquoise represented runs throughout, and I've already delineated that, I'm going to read you what Jorge Clor de Alba has said, but I start here. In effect, I contend that the sunstone constituted the Tlatoani, or sacred bundle, or that which was, quote, covered in turquoise, unquote, and thereby constituted the supernatural bearer of those relics identified with the divinized founder of the community, Huitzilopochtli. According to Aztec scholar Jorge Clor de Alba, 1993, the Tlatoani constituted a fundamental, quote, part of the supernatural powers of the universe, and therefore functioned as a channel through which flowed the sacred forces that empowered, protected, legitimated, and gave a common identity to the village or town, unquote. I therefore contend that the sunstone constituted just such a sacred bundle or turquoise hearth, through which the power of the cosmos was channeled into Mexico Tenochtitlan via the hybrid visage of Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, the ninth huei Tlatoani, or great speaker of the Mexica Aztec, and that by virtue of the guise as his guise as Sol Nueve, or the ninth sun, and the teoixiptla, or deity impersonator of Itzpapalotl, the clawed butterfly, that frames the disembodied head of the great speaker. In the final analysis, Moctezuma Xocoyotzin's ritual oversight of the most auspicious pairing of the Xiutlalpili new fire ceremony and the Panquetzalisli raising of the banners devoted to the god of war and sacrifice, Huitzilopochtli, portends the great speaker's life from his birth in 1467, one reed, or what I'm now calling James Reed, through to his death 52 years later in 1519 on one reed, James. So that's kind of where I'm going with this. This represents literally the Tlatoani, or sacred bundle of the Mexica, but I'm not done yet. So when we talk about that central image of the sunstone, I refer you back to the four mirrors that reflect the four previous cosmogonic epochs, which I believe, if you look at the conflations that are going on and the idea of a scrying mirror and looking into that other world, that world of darkness, we Christians, or we Muslims and others, all have this notion that everything is a place of darkness after death, and everything is light in our world. Well, I believe the Western Nahua, the Mexica, flipped that on its head. And so in a paper that I did some years ago, which unfortunately I never published, I argued that the interpretation of Aztlán by Moctezuma and his soothsayers was one in which he literally flipped the world on its head And the description given of Aztlán by the soothsayers is literally one of a place of whiteness. It is Mexico Tenochtitlan with the hill of Coyotepec, the curved hill, described as part of Aztlán, but it's in a world of light and white. And so for me, that means the Aztecs were living in a world of darkness, and many of their monuments, in effect, reflect this. And some would use the term monstrosities, although for me, Coatlicue is in fact a beautiful incarnation of the cosmos. Some might beg to differ. But again, think of this central being as a conflation of multiple images. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, we have the four world epics represented in this place of darkness. We have Itzpapalotl with its four wings as scrying mirrors. And then, of course, Yohualtecuhtli, call him the Dark Lord or the Lord of the Night. And you see the claws of the Obsidian Butterfly. These are her most prominent features. So when we look at these monuments, this one has often been referred to as a Chichimec or the Cihuacuatl. And the reality is, if you look at it closely, what you're looking at are the wings of this deity. And for me, this signifies not so much those beings, but basically Itzpapalotl, the Obsidian Butterfly or moth, descending from the heavens and bringing the Chichimec and the Cihuacuatl with her to devour the world in its last days. When we look at how Itzpapalotl is characterized, and this first context by Rios, Itzpapalotl signifies a knife of butterflies or an obsidian butterfly. He, she, again, the androgeneity, was one of those gods who, as they affirm, were expelled from heaven. And on this account, they paint him, her, surrounded with knives and wings of butterflies. They represent him with the feet of an eagle because they say that he, she, occasionally appears to them and that they only see the feet of an eagle. Rios goes on to say, he, she, and this sounds like a lot of our pronouns these days, he, she presided over these 13 signs, the first of which, the house, they considered unfortunate because they said that the demons came through the air on that sign in the figure of women such as we designate witches, who usually went to the highways where they met in the form of a cross and to solitary places, again, Rios. En la taxonomía moderna, la mariposa negra como la obsidiana es una especie nocturna, la Rothschildia orizaba de la familia Saturnidae, conocida popularmente como la mariposa cuatro espejos. As I've noted, literally, she is, and the butterfly is identified with the butterfly of the four mirrors, and that from Hayden and Beau Citron. When we look at this butterfly image, and I've seen this, I've traveled all over Mesoamerica, often by myself with a backpack full of camera equipment. Don't tell anybody. But in the process, since I was 17, I've gone to most of the major sites, had plenty of adventures and a few of them not so fun. But you see the butterfly, which we see as a breastplate on the warriors at Tula Hidalgo. This photo I borrow from John Bartos, only because I didn't have time to pull up my own images of Tula Hidalgo. I've been shooting there with Kodachrome film, digital, all of it over the years. Just didn't have time. But you see the butterfly. And if you actually examine these monuments, on the backside of these warriors, you have what appears to be an incarnation of a sun disk on each of these beings. So they literally are warriors of the sun. And they have the butterfly because, as the Mexica would tell us, dead warriors would return from the afterlife in the form of butterflies or moths. Here we have a depiction. This is from the Instituto de Cooperación Iberoamericana in Madrid. And this particular one shows not only the tecpatl or obsidian blades, but the wings of the butterfly and the claws that are so often described as eagle talons with a skeletal face. And of course, all the accoutrements of what looks like Tlatoani. But again, I would argue this is in fact Itzpapalotl, the obsidian butterfly. When we look at the actual creature after which I believe the Aztecs drew their inspiration, you see the open wings of the butterfly in this case have been interpreted as olin or movement or creative energy, color de alba. But if you look at the varying incarnations, you have the 4 wings. And in this one, you have these elements that peoples in northern Mexico in the Chichimeca identify as teoixiptla, or obsidian blades, or arrowheads. And then when you look at the way it's represented, Itzpapalotl is represented, you see that the 4, or in this case 6 wings, 4, and then again, here's an incarnation of Itzpapalotl with the 4 wings. So again, referencing an actual creature from which that inspiration is drawn. When we look at other representations, we see that Itzpapalotl was born as a backpack or banner on the backs of warriors. We see that it was carved into monuments. It was used as yakamesli nose ornaments by the elite. It manifests in this way with the 4 wings as a supernatural being with talons. And then here we see a butterfly literally covered in teoixiptla obsidian daggers or blades. This is my representation from an AI rendition. And of course, I think I had this backwards because my intent was to show you, well, actually I don't. This represents what artificial intelligence produced when I described this being. And of course, I use the moth as the example. Here you have the 4 wings, you have the clawed hands of the clawed butterfly, if you will. And then this is what I'm trying to say without using the central iconography and using rather the discus or wheel of the ball court, if you want to call it that, and the butterfly emerging from this underworld place, the place of Yohualtecuhtli, the night sun, the place of the dead worlds, the 4 previous ages, the ancestors, and of course, emerging from the Sacatepoyi, which is literally instrumental to blood sacrifice, auto-sacrificial, and otherwise, and doing so within the context of the turquoise hearth from which it is emerging. Also representing, as I mentioned, the sacred bundle. So I close with just a couple more images. I have no idea where I'm at with in terms of time, but here we have this massive monument, the Tlatoani monolith, which, as you can see from the descriptions, weighs over 12 tons. It is 4.19 by 3.62 meters in size. This was discovered relatively recently. And interestingly enough, the color, the polychromy of this monument in some ways is akin to that on the monument identified as the Aztec Sun Stone. This may be, based on current investigations, may be literally a sarcophagus lid identified with the cremations of Huei, the great huei Tlatoani that preceded Motecuhzoma Xocoyotzin. So there's some level of contemporaneity here. In the final analysis, when we look to Motecuhzoma Xocoyotzin, what I've learned of him, especially from a number of scholars who have recently revisited the monuments created during his time, he was a master builder. He sought to reimagine the Mexica cosmos as a form of political and religious power and authority. And so when we look to the characterizations of Motecuhzoma as a cowering little man, which I've seen, or as a superstitious Indian, if you will, the reality is he was truly a great warrior. That is how he rose to the level of the huei, or great Tlatoani, or great speaker. He also had in his mindset and in his vision of the art of the Mexica, a truly profound vision for the future. Unfortunately, the vision went with him because while he commemorated the last new fire ceremony of the Mexica Empire prior to its destruction in 1520 and 21, this last new fire ceremony was one of the most exuberant and important because it was literally celebrating the end of a 52-year cycle, as well as the Panquetzalisli and the tribute to Huitzilopochtli, literally the avatar of the Atl Tlachinoli Holy War, and the rebirth of the 9th sun in the form of Motecuhzoma Xocoyotzin, the 9th huei Tlatoani of the Mexica Aztec. And I close with that, and I thank folks like Harold Mailer, Roberto Rich, Raul Barrera, I put him down twice, Ian Mersel, and of course, James Reed. These guys have been spectacular promoting this effort. I was waiting for the next new fire ceremony to try to post some of my articles on the new fire ceremony or this sunstone, only out of respect to my colleagues like Harold Mailer in Germany, who asked that I put off for a year posting to academia or to ResearchGate. And I have posted my earlier Aztec Sun Stone paper to ResearchGate. So it is there. And that offers an opportunity to look at that earlier paper, replete with a few errors here and there. And then, of course, I thank my colleague, Jennifer Lucido, who's always been there to look over some of my papers, Madeline Rapella, my student, and of course, my family, Linda Marie, Natalie Dawn Maria, and Maya Nicole. And of course, they've been very patient with me. Otherwise, I couldn't do these kinds of things on my schedule. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Rubén. I put on a little turquoise so I could be another deity impersonator for your program. And Anthony Avini once signed his book to me, "To the Real One Read." So you know where that's coming from.
Oh, yeah. You've been in the game long enough. I know where that's coming from. We'll have to do a new fire ceremony for you, but we'll need 8 volunteers for the Sunstone sacrifice.
When is the next end of the 52 years?
I've actually gone through and calibrated, but I'm forgetting that. Okay, if you take 1507 and push it forward in 52-year cycles, but when I pushed it backwards, what was interesting is the 52-year cycles, because bear in mind that Moctezuma Xocoyotzin did not want to celebrate in 1506 because it was a bad omen. And he actually did something revolutionary and he moved it up a year. And so this was a particular auspicious occasion because he had to validate this new cycle. But anyway, the point I was going to make, when you push it back 52 years, it appears to match significant events of, I would say, imperial import in each of those 4 previous suns. So I think that the so-called 4 suns are anchored to political cosmological events that anticipated the 1507 celebration.
There's one question so far. Pearl's asking, and I guess you've known Pearl for a while?
Yes. We just had some discussions literally a day or two ago.
What was the time span of that skull wreck you discovered? Was it over many years?
Well, bear in mind that the earlier skull rack is still under excavation. We believe that the second circular tower was somewhere near where they cut the subway tunnel, because during the course of construction, they found cranial fragments in the debris, and they were in large numbers. And so Raul Barrera believes that second tower was destroyed. Bear in mind that the tower that was discovered dates somewhere to the 1470s, 1480s, probably during the reign of Huei. And bear in mind that Huei, the water dog, had basically conducted a 4-day investiture, if you will, in which some 20,000 war captives were dispatched and their heads decapitated and impaled on that earlier skull rack. So the skulls that were seen were part of that carnage. But according to, and it may be that that particular skull rack maybe has, the 20,000. But bear in mind that when the Aztecs rebuilt the skull rack, possibly under the reign of Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, that particular one was identified by several Spanish soldiers, among them, of course, Hernan Cortez, and the so-called anonymous soldier went through and actually counted each of the massive uprights that were the height of large trees, telephone poles, if you will, and they had crossbars at every 2-foot intervals. The poles, there were 80 of them, and they counted some 80,000 human crania or freshly decapitated heads in varying states of decomposition. And so, I should say, the statistic that I published in my earlier Divine Gourd paper ranges between 80,000 and 135,000. And remember, these are soldiers who have some time on their hands as they're watching all the carnage unfold before them. And so they may not have been particularly attentive to the counts while they were watching their backs. So the figures range between 80 and 135,000 human crania.
Wow.
Oh, and so again, the skull rack that has been found has all the characteristics that were identified by the Spanish, and I used as the basis for reconstructing in my earlier Divine Gourd paper what that structure looked like. And one of the details that I almost found ominous was the way the Spanish described in detail these towers of cal con las calaveras y los dientes pa fuera, the faces of the dead with their teeth literally visible. And when I saw that, I thought, who describes and makes up something like that? Maybe Stephen King, but the reality is, in this case, it was just too consistent. And so when Ortiz de Montellano, for instance, has contested the characterization that there were, as many crania on there. He believes there were a few thousand. The evidence has since proven otherwise. For the earlier skull rack, bear in mind that Moctezuma he went large on virtually everything he did, whether it was the temple stone and its iconography, the Aztec Sun Stone, the modifications to the huei teoixiptla, the Templo Mayor, and a host of other things. But his predecessor rebuilt the empire through war and sacrifice in the wake of the role of the Empire of Michoacan in dispatching over 40,000 Mexica warriors and their allies. I think Huichotl sought to vindicate 10 years hence the rebuilding and the strength and the ferocity of the Mexica Empire in the wake of that huge loss. And then Moctezuma took it even to the next level.
Do you think, before we get to a comment by Cheryl Norman, but when Moctezuma met Cortez, do you think they also tried offering him turquoise before the gold? Is that a possibility?
Well, I have to predicate any kind of response like that on the chronicles that we have. And so far, the gold was clearly the primary, gold and silver. The gold sun and the silver moon were the two primaries. And, that's not the way you're going to get rid of somebody that wants your gold. But I would probably, given the elaborate nature of much of the gold work, much of it does tend to be encrusted with elements of gold, turquoise tesserae or beads or other elements. And so I suspect that turquoise was a part of that equation, especially given that the sun is so intimately linked to fire, to light, and to turquoise.
So Cheryl Norman's saying that the ancient turquoise mines are in Elko, Nevada, and turquoise from these mines was taken through the Parowan Gap, New Mexico, and northern Mexico to central Mexico.
Yes.
And this is from Harbottle and Wygand.
Oh, yes.
You know them.
Yes.
Yes, and they discovered these mines in Elko, Nevada that were taken, the turquoise was taken down into central Mexico through Parowan Gap, New Mexico, northern Mexico to central Mexico.
If you and I agree. In fact, we tend to think only in terms of Cerrillos, Chaco Canyon, maybe a couple of sites in the Southwest, but Wygand in particular, who I had only the greatest, I continue to have the greatest admiration for his work. In my Cambridge University paper, The Turquoise Corridor, we did my colleague Jennifer Lucido and I went through and she created a mapping based on Wygand, and there are turquoise mines all over the Western US, and they're often identified with copper. And obviously in West Mexico, we have others. And I was looking at the Americans were particularly interested in West Mexico for copper, and they were looking for mines. And so they were looking to invest. And there are some early reports that talk about copper deposits and turquoise deposits. But I don't know of anybody that's actually been able to pinpoint them because they seem to have been lost. And so, but I do know about the Nevada mines. And if you go to the Cambridge University article, in there, I do have the mapping and I do show those sites. And in fact, I think we have one as far afield as, well, there's Nevada, there's Arizona, obviously New Mexico, and it's spread across the entire Southwest. So when we talk about Chaco Canyon, we're really kind of limiting that. But even there, scholars who I never would have imagined would have acknowledged that Mesoamerica played any key role in the Southwest are now writing books about the cosmologies of Mesoamerica in the Southwest. And I think it's great stuff they're doing. And I do feel, yes. And so I do feel that oftentimes they feel that they have to almost not necessarily apologize, but prepare for the defense of an attack. Because I'm used to that. I've been talking about the Mesoamerican presence in the Southwest in my grad school debates with Randall McGuire, for example. We used to go back and forth on this issue. And I was glad to see he kind of opened up and has done a great deal to show that there was no Mexican border there when the Mesoamericans and the Southwesterners were literally traversing the region. And I think we need to remember that because at one point, when a key scholar had come to our department, I was asked to translate for him in my pocho, and he gave a talk, and I'd asked him, say a few sentences, I'll translate. Well, he went on and on and on, and then I had to translate some really complex stuff. Well, after what I thought was a botched translation, I was leaving, and one of my fellow grad students decided to give me an extra kick in the side and basically said, well, just because you have New England style houses in the Eastern US doesn't mean the British came to America. And I thought, wow, I think you need to revisit that part of American history. I didn't say that to her. I was trying to be respectful, but I've dealt with a lot of that in my life. So
Thank you.
no, thank you for allowing me to expand upon that. I talk too much, but that works. So
Charlie's wondering why we can't hear the purring of my cat. Rubén, if you wouldn't mind, could you take off your screen now so that
yes, let me do that.
people can see you big when you're answering questions?
Okay.
All right, there we go. So is there anybody who wants to unmute and ask a question? I
don't bite. So,
Michael Smith said he had to leave, but great. I had chatted with him about him asking some questions.
I have a question.
Marilyn?
Hey, it's Marilyn. Yes, and I did put it in the chat, and it has to do with when. Let me see if I can read it on the chat.
Yeah, let's see. Were those?
It has to do with when people are going to be sacrificed. Are they given any pain, something to reduce the pain, or is the pain a requirement of the ceremony?
Well, based on what I've seen, whether you go through Sahagún or other chronicles, it appears that there's kind of a constellation of different ceremonies, and they have different requirements. And while this might sound pretty macabre, there was back in the 80s, there was a Cuban American drug dealer. He became a kind of a narco, and he was American. He was a Cuban American. He crossed the border into northern Mexico, Tamaulipas, and he started his own drug cartel. And he started dispatching rivals. And interestingly enough, he probably murdered scores of Mexicans, and nobody took notice. The police didn't investigate. And then he ended up with a cult of witches, if you will, which is what the authorities call them. These were all these women that were attracted to this very suave and debonair, very attractive, well-dressed individual. And he was running drugs across the border. And he came to believe that only through human sacrifice could he and his people be invisible to the authorities? And so what he began to do is, in the book that a journalist wrote, is called Buried Secrets. He speaks in rather graphic detail of a situation in which one of his fellow drug dealers literally blew right through a police barricade thinking he was invisible. And the police tracked him down to a ranch, and then they went into the ranch, and when they got there, they found a shed. They opened the shed, and there were human body parts basically nailed and hung from the walls and ceiling. There was a massive kettle filled with human blood and body parts. And the authorities were so horrified, they brought in an exorcist instead of doing the typical forensic analysis that we like to do here in the States. And after they did the exorcism, they burned the shed. And soon thereafter, they found bodies that had been dismembered with hands sticking up out of the ground, with clothes hangers had been used so they could pull up the arms of the dead and check on them every so often. This individual was murdering people throughout Mexico, and eventually his own very brash behavior got him caught up in a gunfight in Mexico City, and he and his fellow narcos were killed. But they were absolutely convinced, and this is the response to your question, that the only way to draw the power of the supernatural and the Dark Lord, if you will, was to hear your victim scream aloud. And unfortunately, what set off this chain reaction that led to the death of these narcos is they had a fellow narco and they were literally dismembering him, and he never screamed. And so they intensified the torture. He never screamed. And ultimately they dispatched him, and now they were in fear that they would be discovered. So what did they do? There was an American, a young man was in northern Mexico with his friends, and they kidnapped him. They took him into this chamber, and he screamed like hell. And they were convinced that they could now literally pass through ports of entry unseen, unscathed. And of course, the FBI got involved, and then they began finding all the bodies. I think some 60 to 80 bodies that were ultimately discovered. But they wouldn't have been had it not been for an American being killed and the FBI getting involved. So what I'm saying is, as sick as this sounds, I believe, based on what the Spanish themselves talk about, is the screaming of the captives. That was part of it. The fire ceremony, for example, there were variations of it in which an individual, a live captive, would be actually thrown into a brazier until the flesh started to be cooked away, and then they pull him out and then cut his heart out. And you know that that's going to induce screaming. So I do believe that was part of it. But to also move forward with your principal question, did they give them anything to assuage the pain or the suffering? Well, early on, maybe from high school, I was really into Peter T. First's work, Hallucinogens and Culture. He talks about ololiqui being consumed, morning glory or Jimson weed. The seed pods produce a tea that give you horrifying hallucinations. And I remember that he talked about ololiqui and some of these poultices, which had venomous creatures in them, being given and drunk by both the priest and the captives. So one could argue that they were literally pulling a Timothy Leary LSD trip all the way to the top of the monument. And so it's not clear whether or not cognition was still in order, whether their mental stability was still intact, but it was, I believe there were some elements of that, because again, these were sacred ceremonies. But I also believe that they had a clear political undertone that kept them going, more so than strictly a spiritual or supernatural dimension.
Wow. You keep mentioning people I've met. I met Timothy Leary twice.
I met him once at a school talk. I
And,
confronted him about his ideas that everything moved west. I said, no, what about the Asians that moved east? You know, civilization doesn't always progress west. It goes in every imaginable direction. He disagreed, but, you know, we had a discussion over it.
And out of high school, I was hitchhiking out in California, and I climb down the cliff at Big Sur and slip with the seals and the sea lions. And when I came up, I was on the guardrail hitchhiking, and an Indian guy in an old pickup truck picked me up, and we had the best conversation. And he goes, "There's somebody I know you need to meet." So we drove back, and real, all in the woods and real, and we stopped and we walked up and to the glass sliding doors rather than the front door. And so we could look in and we'd see this guy get up out of bed, put a robe on, and then come and open the glass sliding doors. And there was a giant painting he was working on, and then it was Jose Arguelles. And he was working on one of his paintings for, oh gosh, what was his book early on? Earth Ascending, or one of those. But anyway, I also met Jose Arguelles. And does anybody else want to unmute for ask Rubén a question?
I was just looking through some of the comments, and those are appreciated. So,
Yeah.
but I take it that this will be put onto YouTube. So if you
Oh
want
yes, within a couple days, I'll put it on. I'll send out notices to everybody. Already, who was saying they want to watch it 4 or 5 times because it's so much information.
Yeah, it's a lot of information. I was trying to get through it in a civilized manner, but I understand that sometimes these go varying lengths, and it is complex. That's why I kept reiterating things about Itzpapalotl, the Obsidian Butterfly, or other aspects of the iconography.
And was it warriors who died in battle ascended as butterflies, or was it also the sacrifice victims, or just
it was predominantly both men and women, of course, because there were women who fought on the battlefield in varying capacities, but you had predominantly warriors who died in battle and women who died in childbirth, and so they were seen as incarnations of this primordial energy that fueled the Aztec Empire or Mexica Empire.
All right. Well, nobody else wants to unmute and come forward. Soaring Bear, I'd love to hear from you. I've seen you on your Facebook page, and you look so much like my brother from Colorado who passed. I'd love to hear from you. All right. Well, I guess with that, I'll end the presentation.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Rubén. This has been really, really interesting. And thanks for everybody for attending.
I hope I didn't come across as a missionary, because I'm not advocating the return of the new fire ceremony. I couldn't get any of my colleagues to volunteer, so it's just going to have to probably be a few smokes and maybe some sage.
I think it'd be pretty hard nowadays to extinguish all the fires everywhere.
Yes, exactly. I did want to mention that there was recently an ENA publication or a report that during the colonial period, there had been palatial residences that had been part of the original core of the city, where they actually conducted what appears to have been the equivalent of a new fire ceremony after the Spanish conquest. So they hadn't given up. And this would have been something that would have happened in the second half of the 16th century. I also believe that the new fire ceremony were not exclusive to central Mexico, that they were conducted far and wide. Even the Maya, clearly from Copan, had a vested interest in traveling many days to Teotihuacan in order to undergo investiture as sun-faced lords or fire-born lords. And again, that should be an indication to the Mayanists out there that the fire-born lords are clearly fire-born by virtue of the new fire.
Yeah. And also, Copan's on the same 14.8 latitude as Ixtapa, but as the information went up into the highlands, the Highlanders, they would go to Copan in the east to receive their, whatever you call it, right to
Yes.
rule.
Investiture.
Investiture? All
Yeah.
right. Yeah, Copan is a beautiful, really important place. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Rubén.
Okay, well, you all have a good evening and thank you for participating, attending. It's always nice to have an audience, and I continue to write, so my material's out there. I placed the article, as I noted before, the one done in Germany in 2021 or 2021. I did post it to ResearchGate 3 years after the publication. Well, this year, and I may post it to academia, though. Let's just say I have some misgivings with academia, given their more commercial orientation of late. I'd rather stick with the poor scholars that are out there, trying to tough it out and be noted by their fellows. So,
Yeah. And I'd like to get a hold of that turquoise corridor, at least an article or something that I can make an article out of, and also promote your latest sacrifice book.
yeah, I'm going to put my email down here. I just put my email if anybody's interested in either the turquoise corridor paper, where I talk about the bifurcation of elite status in Mesoamerica between the central Mexican highlands and the Maya lowlands. I believe it takes place in the 6th century, and then we see the collapse of Teotihuacan. And so the Toltecs take up the mantle, and from that point on, the Mexicans are focused on social jade, which is not chemical jade or geological jade, and the Maya continue to hold literally the source on the Motagua River, as did their predecessors, the Olmec. And so clearly the Mexicans in the earliest period valued jade, but now they had been expelled from the region, and they began moving northward. And we have a host of scholars now investigating those dimensions of it. And I do talk about that in the Turquoise Corridor paper published by Cambridge. So
yeah, those I love their papers because they're always open access as long as you credit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but if for those of you that are here, please feel free to write, and I can send you. Be specific if you want the German paper or the Turquoise Corridor. I'd be happy to send it.
Yeah. Alrighty. Well, thank you. Once again.
No, thank you. Yes, thank you all. So, and have a good evening with the night sun. Sol Nueve.
All right. Thanks to G.Mendoza, and thanks for watching this Aztlander program recording. Please subscribe to this Aztlander YouTube channel. To subscribe to free monthly issues of the Aztlander, Magazine of the Americas, contact your host, Jim Reed, at mayaman@bellsouth.net. Thanks again.